Hello, and welcome to Kelda Conversations. The topic for today is everyday CI, how everyone can apply continuous improvement every day starting today. I'm your host, Edward Blackman, and with me is the co-host, Bill Costantino. A summary of the event today, we're going to talk about Toyota Kata, practical problem solving, continuous improvement, and a mix of behavioral science. Background on Bill Costantino. He's been a friend and mentor of mine for a long time now, many years. He was founder and senior partner of the W3 Group, worked for Toyota, taught as an instructor for the University of Michigan Lean certificate program. He worked closely with Mike Rother, author of Toyota Kata. He was actually one of his go-to consultants that he would use quite a bit. He worked with Lean Enterprise Institute, taught Improvement Kata seminars, Improvement Kata experience, leadership briefings, and the Improvement Kata field course. Suffice it to say, he is an ambassador for Toyota Kata and a frequent lecturer and keynote speaker around the globe, and I am honored to have him co-host today. My name is Edward Blackman. I'm the founder and managing partner of Kelda Consulting. We combine behavioral science with continuous improvement to create powerful business transformations. Here you'll see our brochure with links to articles, podcasts, videos, and contact information. In terms of logistics, this slide deck will be posted within about a week on LinkedIn, along with a video recording of today. So you'll have access to all the materials and all the linked resources embedded within. Skill fluency. If you're not familiar with the fluency wheel, it's part of the skills matrix approach within continuous improvement. The basic concept is for any skill, level 0, no fluency, level 1, I've studied it, 2, I've applied it with help, 3, I'm independent with the skill, and then 4, I have coached others on the skill. And so for us today, the goal is to move from red level 1 to green level 1, so that you've studied it and possibly have the skills to be able to apply it. If you're not familiar with the skills fluency wheel, there will be a link at the bottom here that you can learn more about it. The agenda for today, we'll spend about 20 minutes on the background on CI, Kata, a little bit of behavioral science, get into the philosophical debate of actions versus practice and a couple other items, and then we'll get into the everyday CI skill itself. So for background on Toyota Kata, I'll hand it over to Sensei Bill.
So good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here. It seems that with this whole COVID situation, everyone's collective Zoom skills have been dramatically improved or increased, like it or not, it seems. But yeah, Toyota Kata, it's interesting because Mike obviously wrote the book, and when it was in manuscript form, it actually had already gone to publication, and I had been working at Toyota for 7 years, and he asked me to take a look at it and make comments. And, you know, I read it, and I had 3 or 4 post-it notes on almost every page in terms of just, you know, comments here, comments there, all this feedback and, you know, confirmation and detailed information. But I think what Mike did with this is he really really distilled down the essence of what the whole continuous improvement and problem-solving activity and methodology was at Toyota. And I honestly, you know, I had seen other, you know, approaches in terms of continuous improvement, but Mike really did boil it down with this book, which I think was a great resource. And what, and obviously it has, you know, generated tremendous value in the fact that it's still in the public eye, it's still relevant, it's universally applicable. So I can't speak highly enough about the work that Mike's doing around Toyota Kata. Since he wrote the book, and I forget when it was actually released, it's been a number of years ago now, but the whole learning and progression of understanding about it and how it works, how to use it, has also expanded. So yeah, if you would, Edward, go ahead, next slide. So there's this is sort of the textbook, you know, nuts and bolts of Toyota Kata. And what I want to talk about here briefly before we move through any of these items is that a kata is basically, it's a routine, it's a practice, it's something that you do consistently or reflexively over and over again. So for those of you that drive to work, remember the good old days when you used to drive to work? For those of you that drive to work, you know, you have a routine in terms of how you handle your morning, how you get to work, the route you take, etc. And it pretty much is on autopilot. It's on automatic because it's become deeply ingrained. Okay, you've actually developed a habit to do things that way. And what a kata is, basically, is a deeply ingrained routine. It comes from martial arts, where a martial artist will have a kata. They'll have, you know, if you've ever seen the movies of people that do jujitsu or whatever, you know, they're going through a series of movements in a very structured and rhythmical way, and they've been doing it for 25 years. Okay, so, well, haven't they learned it by now? Of course they've learned it by now, but there's always a deeper level of learning and understanding that comes as you do it. You could say the same thing about any world-class sports, you know, luminary musicians, etc. They're always refining and refining and refining. So a kata is simply a routine, a practice that you continually hone. And what's interesting is that in getting some information from Mike lately, they've called this, instead of Toyota Kata, they're calling it now the starter kata. Or if you're from Boston like I am, it would be the starter kata, where you begin, okay? And it's a simple set. At first, you know, it's a set of tools. And you can see the learner's storyboard, which has, you know, what's the focus, process, challenge, etc., target condition, current condition, the experiment record, and the obstacle parking lot. Some of you, if you've been involved with it, establishing a target condition, these are the basic tools, okay? And Mike has been certainly framed these initially this way and has been refining them ever since. Go ahead to the next slide, Edward.
Sure.
And then likewise, there is a starter, that's hard to say for Boston, starter kata for the coach, which basically is these 5 questions, okay? And the coach would interact with a learner. You can see coaches and the learner are both at the storyboard, and they have a discussion, which takes, you know, 15 or 20 minutes, but it's anchored around these 5 questions. So that's sort of the mechanics of it. If you were a beginner in learning to play piano, you would work on your scales, okay? And as a late learner of piano, I have come to appreciate what that does. You work on scales, you work on very basics and fundamentals to begin to develop a mindset, to begin to develop fluency, okay? Next one, Edward. So the core, really, of the steps of the improvement kata, if you look to the upper right, it's, oops, we flipped back, Edward. At least mine did, there we go. 4 stages or 4 steps of the improvement kata. If you look to the upper right, the first one is get the direction or the challenge. Okay, so know where you're headed is basically the very first step. Where am I going? The next step, 2, which is the bottom left-hand side, is see where you are now. Understand what's my current condition with respect to that challenge. So if you don't understand the challenge, where you are now is kind of irrelevant, or it's not as powerful because you could potentially go anywhere. And what's important in step number 3 is that this next target condition that you're going to set is not going to get you all the way to beat the challenge. The challenge could be 2 or 3 years in getting there. But the next target condition could be anywhere from 1 week to a month to 6 months. But the point is, directionally, it's aligned in going from where I am now to this challenge, and I'm on the right path to get there. And then comes step number 4, moving toward your next target condition by experimenting and adjusting based on what you learn. This is a critical distinction, which is much different from the way that a lot of, quote, problem solving happens, in that people basically come up with an action plan and they execute the action plan. If you have an action plan, you're really not in a discovery mode, you're in an execution mode to just get something done, and you know how you're going to do it. So there's really no room for discovery when you have an action plan. And you need action plans, you have to execute and get things done, but you're not learning and you're not expanding your knowledge base. Next slide, Edward. So the way that we've often looked at it is like this, and the key is that small, rapid experiments advance our knowledge quickly. So if I'm at a current condition today, right now, and I'll just take a simple, I don't know, I'll take a sales example. Okay, so if currently I'm doing a level of business and I have a customer base of I don't know, 1,500 people, and what I want to do is get to a customer base of 5,000 people. What should happen with that next target condition is it should be a stretch. It should be something that I don't know how I'm going to get there. You know, and that's different than saying, okay, I'm going to do this little step and I know exactly what I'm going to do. The next target condition ideally stretches your threshold of knowledge to be slightly puckered up. It's like, you know, you should get the deer in the headlight thing. I'm not sure I know how to get there, because what that does is it allows you to begin experimenting and actually learning. So what there'll be when you have this current condition and you establish a next target condition, the gap that's in there is this gray zone. It's unknown what I need to do in order to get there. And each of those little dots that's in that gray zone would be an experiment. So the first thing I'm going to do is, I don't know, I'm going to look at the demographics of my customer base. And that may be the first dot. And then when you look at when you get that data, when you get the feedback from that first experiment, that informs you where you go for the next experiment. That informs you in terms of your next step. Okay, now I'm going to look at, instead of demographics, the next thing I'm going to look at is geography. Okay, and then you get that point. Now I have demographics and geography. Now what's the next step that I take? And you can see, looking at that sort of twisted line there, it's not a straight line, okay? There's discovery along the way. Some of those dots you actually go backwards, implying that you're going to make a mistake. Your idea about how you will move forward, in fact, doesn't work. And oftentimes the failure leads to a greater level of understanding, a greater insight than a success. So this is really a fundamental core of the Toyota Kata methodology, and the roots of it is that small, rapid experiments are what advance our knowledge quickly, especially when we're facing challenges that we don't know how we're going to move through them. Okay, let's move on. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the group is large enough that we can't really have a lot of Q&A as we move. But I think in the chat, if you have questions, please post them there. Someone's going to be looking at the chat, and we'll have time at the end to hopefully answer some of your questions. So please do interact that way if you can. Go ahead, Edward, next one. So this is something that Mike sent me just recently in terms of what is scientific thinking, okay? So there are really 3 points to it. One is that acknowledging that our comprehension is always incomplete and possibly wrong. So it takes a certain level of humility to recognize that regardless of how much you think you know, there's always something deeper, there's always something more, okay? It's going to be incomplete and may very likely be wrong because of being incomplete. The second point is assuming that answers will be found by test rather than just deliberation. This is also an enormously important piece, is that the bias is toward action. The bias is to experiment. Not think about it in a conference room, not come up with a long list of the 24 action items. But by doing this, by experimenting, I think this is a key piece, is to have a mindset that this is an experiment. You can make a prediction and then test that prediction with the experiment. So you say, well, I'm going to try this, and I think my marketing is going to improve if I work in a demographic of 30 to 45-year-olds, and you target something to 30 or 45-year-olds, and you imagine that that's going to double your engagement or your customer list. And in fact, it doesn't. So, what happened there? Okay. So this is a key piece, is the willingness to experiment and the willingness to let that experiment guide you along a path of discovery. The third piece of scientific thinking is appreciating that differences between a prediction and what actually happened can be a useful source of learning and adjustment. Okay. Why didn't it work out? And you may get feedback, but that is a crucial piece. So, and I know in business, it has never changed, right? The focus and the pressure is always to get results as soon as possible. So this takes a bit of tempering to be willing to experiment and learn as the precursor to getting the result. And we can talk about that in more detail, I'm sure, when we get to talking about how companies work and executive need for showing the benefits. But let me leave it there, Edward, and go ahead. I think next slide is something you're going to speak to.
Okay, so if you're not familiar, a lot of this material is based on behavioral science, and there's a classic article that I absolutely love from Stephen Spear, Learning to Lead at Toyota. It's a really short read. It's just about seven pages, but it really gets into the fundamental way to develop behaviors, to develop new skills. And that's a crux of the conversation today, is the skill acquisition itself. And the protagonist in the article is led through a way to develop basic, if you will, problem-solving skills, and in the fashion that Toyota does. And they find that the individual isn't learning fast enough. And so they actually increase the number of repetitions the individual goes through to learn and acquire this skill. And so it's a fascinating article, and it reveals a lot of how to actually do this. To get into it a little bit, one of the reasons that we're having this discussion today, and Bill and I have had the debate for years now, is some of the struggles that people have when they say, okay, I want to try CI at my organization. I want to try Kata at my organization, and the struggles that they experience when they go through that. We want to help you avoid those struggles and be more successful at CI, at Kata. Now, there's a lot of terminology that's debated. And is it an approach, a problem-solving methodology? Is it a way of thinking? I'm trying to sidestep that and just be more general and say Kata or CI, and get into more of the practical items related to it. At the intersection of Kata and behavioral science, I think we're trying to say a lot of the same things. Leaders will sometimes ask, what does better look like? Or, what does a perfect patient experience or a perfect customer experience look like? From a CI perspective, we often ask, what is our goal, or what is our ideal state or future state? What's future state 1 or future state 2? Kata, one variant of it is they'll ask about what is the challenge or the target condition. There's a few different items there. From a behavioral science perspective, might not like the terminology, but we often ask, what is the terminal behavior or the ultimate behavior that we're trying to develop? And then from a goal-directed systems design perspective, GDSD, you start with that and you work backwards from that. And so if ideal state is I have the chief operating officer for an organization going through a structured problem-solving approach, okay, how do I develop that skill? And so we start with the goal, if you will, and work backwards. This slide was provided by Sensei Bill. We're trying to visually depict the relationship between thoughts and behaviors. Did you want to make any comments on this?
No, that they both have to be there, Edward. And I think one of the things that Mike really put his hands on when he was writing Toyota Kata, at first he was asking a lot of people, well, how does Toyota teach? And I can tell you, having been there 7 years, that they teach in a very Zen way, which is you keep working and keep working, and you keep observing and you keep working. So it's very much sort of an apprentice model. And within Toyota and the way that they work at Japan, with a commitment to lifetime employment, you've got people that have been there 25, 30 years, and they advance every 5 or 10 years. But it's basically a watch me and learn approach. What Mike put his fingers on, and I think rightly so, is that in the Western cultures, we want to know what's going on. Okay, we want to have a mental model. So it's important, as far as I see, for changing behavior, and that's really what the essence of this is about, is how do we change our behavior to become yet more effective? We need both the thinking and the behavior. The idea is not to wind up with a bunch of trained monkeys who simply go through the same routine over and over again without thinking and understanding the concept and the model that's there. So I just want to, there's an old saying, of course, that you can think your way into a new way of behaving, or you can behave your way into a new way of thinking. And the answer is both. It does take both. I think having at the beginner level. At the beginner level, it's much more behavior. Simply do as I do. And as you progress with this, as your skills develop, you want to be thinking about what's the model behind here? How effective is this model? How effective am I in using this model? So I think it takes both of these, and it's not simply a behavior-based, apply the tool and all things will be well. Especially if you want to have a long-term culture change where you're creating a culture, creating an organization of independent thinkers, problem solvers, and people who can face challenges and overcome those challenges. So just a plug for both. They need to be there in equal measure.
Good point, sir. And I'll have to say, one of the reasons Bill and I have had a relationship for so long is that we have healthy debates. So whether we agree or disagree or grow and start to learn from one another, we have very healthy, respectful debates. And so this starts to hit on one of the points where we might have a bit of a distinction between how we talk about these things, but that's okay. It's, we're growing and learning from each other, and it's a wonderful thing. From a behavioral science perspective, we acknowledge thinking, but we tend to think of behavior as the expression of thinking. And while we're not able to necessarily impact thinking directly, we impact it through behavior. So I have no idea whether or not the audience is thinking about a red car or a pink car right now. The only way I would know is when they express it. And one way they might express it is through vocal behavior. And there's a whole genre called verbal behavior that's a subset of behavior analysis or behavioral science as well. So we try to train and develop behavior in order to impact thinking. And
all right, Edward. So let's continue the debate just very briefly on this. Okay. So one of the things that I did at Toyota was I got certified in job instruction training. Okay, which basically is teaching people a skill about how to do a job correctly. And one of the things they do is they break down the job into the major step, key point, and reasons. Okay. Now, if all I wanted to do is have a person behave in a certain way, I would show them the steps, have them repeat the steps, and they would behave in a certain way. But one of the things that's critical in the job instruction training is the explanation of the reasons why, okay, which is exclusively a thinking process, okay, exclusively a thought, awareness or understanding. So I just want to, again, sort of, push back, right, that there is going to be behavior, and the question is, at the end of the day, if you have one operator who's trained just with major steps, key points, and another operator who's trained major steps, key points, and reasons, each of them runs 500 parts. Which one is going to have fewer defects? It's the one that understands the reasons, because they have a deeper insight in terms of the way that the system works, why they need to look there, and their attention is reinforced with it. So I agree with you. The behavior is the expression of it, but the depth of the thinking is critical, and I think we'll hit on it a couple of other points as well. But this is a case where we furiously agree, right? I furiously agree with what you're saying.
I think so, and if I may understand your point, them expressing is what you would consider thinking. Is that correct? Okay. I consider expressing, and expressing would be body language and words, typically, and sometimes at Toyota drawings as well. I would classify those things as behavior. Talking, drawing, body language are all behaviors. They're observable, right? If I put a video camera on you, I could see you express these things, and I interpret those expressions as thinking.
Okay. All right, that's a deep rabbit hole. Let's in a irrelevant one, but maybe another another discussion.
So to get into it more, there's a procedure called errorless distinction training procedure. I took a little liberty with the title, but the concept is basically you get a person fluent with a large distinction, and then you get more granular with the distinction as they're successful with it. And so the non-relevant examples that you'll see on the left-hand side is the individual able to, and using adolescent examples here, able to distinguish between a picture of a dog and a tree. And not until they successfully make that distinction, this is a tree, this is a tree, they're doing it correctly every time, do we start to get more granular with the distinction. Okay, is this a pine tree or a maple tree? And so I used a because I know you're doing a lot of practice with pianos right now, Sensei Bill. I used a sound one as well, example in here. So is this the sound of a piano or a guitar? And not until they successfully distinguish the two do we go beyond that and say, okay, is this an electric guitar or an acoustic guitar? The box on the right, the relevant examples, is where a lot of us CI practitioners start to get a little pedantic about this. We start to get really emotional about, well, is it a solution? Is it an experiment? Is it a countermeasure? And I'm going to say, when we're trying to make the large scale distinction, it's just, is it the problem or solution? And so one of the ways that we talk about this is through skill acquisition and skill fluency. And I want to give credit to Dr. Leiker, Jeff Leiker, another professor at U of M. By the way, I'm amazed at the number of really highly skilled individuals and thought leaders that are in Michigan, coincidentally. But Dr. Leiker wrote a lot of books, including one of my favorites, Toyota Lean Leadership, which I would consider an excellent leadership book that just also happens to be about lean and continuous improvement. In there, he talks about shu-ha-ri and the stages that people go through as they acquire a skill. And so a straightforward example over on the right is the cooking example. So first you learn a recipe, then you start to tweak a recipe, and then finally, it's called the freedom to express, but you start to create a new recipe yourself. And so people go through these stages in order when they develop a new skill. Now, from a behavioral science perspective, the idea is start extremely basic, start simple, start at the large scale tree or dog, and then get more granular as they're successful with that. And so at the highest level, and I think you've experienced this as well, Bill, people really struggle with problem versus solution. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times when I work with organizations, their problem statement is just a re-engineered solution. So the problem I'm trying to solve is I have no ERP software. And so the only solution you can go to is I need ERP software. And I think you shared a good one the other day regarding drills. Would you mind sharing that?
Yeah, it's a very sort of simple thing that a person is working on a project and says, well, actually what I need to do is I need to get a drill and I need to get a bunch of drill bits. And in fact, that's what I need is the drill and the drill bits. And in fact, what he actually needed was a hole in a piece of material. He didn't need drills and a drill bit. The drill and drill bit was a means to get a hole in the material.
Yes.
So it takes a shift in terms of, backing out a bit and not getting entangled in what you think needs to happen in order to produce a result. That's really the key.
Very well said, sir.
Yeah.
So once people start to, so a coaching session around this would be, we would work with an individual and just have them identify what is the problem or the solution. And we work through good problem statements and good solution statements. And then after they've done that, basic tree versus dog, guitar versus piano thing, then we start to build on that. Yeah. And from my perspective, the next level build looks like this.
Edward, just go back 1 second to that.
Oh, sure.
I just want to make one point. It is, I'll tell you, one of the biggest paradigm shifts that happens is that people think they understand what a problem is, and they really don't. And it is two things. One is often people get very frustrated in terms of what the problem is, and how you define a problem actually, based on performance with data, et cetera. Relative to a standard or relative to an objective. So just understanding how do you even define a problem, that very often is a wake-up moment for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
And another flavor that comes through with this is people's pet project. That I've wanted to get, whatever it is, visual recognition software on this piece of equipment for years. That if we had visual recognition software. So a person's coming in absolutely convinced that the visual recognition software is going to solve the problem. And they don't really even define further, quantify, and understand the scope of what the problem actually is. So that's no small piece when Edward says, well, we help people understand the problem. That's usually a giant piece
Yeah,
in terms of paradigm shift. It really is.
absolutely. And if I may build on that a little bit, it's hard enough to develop this skill one-on-one in isolation. But when we start to talk about concepts like resistance to change or organizational change management, why doesn't everybody else in the room agree that this is the path we should go down? And I would argue, well, the reason you might be experiencing, quote, resistance to change or struggling to get your solution implemented or buy into your solution or plan or your experiment is that you haven't aligned around the problem statement first. Right? If you're trying to solve the same problem, then people are more likely to be bought into your solution. And so the build on that then gets into this. So 5 basic questions. It's a variant of the Kata questions, just much simplified. And by the way, I want to say I completely agree with all of Bill's statements around Kata. I absolutely think that better or ideal looks like a lot of the starter Kata items that you saw earlier. It's just how do we get to that, right? And one of the struggles that I've seen with people that I'll say 6 months to a year after they've started with Kata, you don't see any trace of it anymore in the organization, is because they focused too much on the artifacts, the learner storyboards, making sure everybody had a copy of the card, and they didn't focus enough on the behaviors. And I think one of the reasons that they did that is it's much easier for people to see a learner storyboard and accomplish erecting one than it is for them to develop behaviors. So it's completely understandable that that tends to be the focus instead of the other. So talking through this, the basic structure, and I'll call this a mindset as well, because one of the things some of the individuals on the call know are some old interns of mine, is that when you go into a meeting, one of the things that benefits you is when you listen to the conversation that's occurring and you ask yourself, okay, are we talking about the plan? Or are we talking about the cause? Or are we talking about the goal? And are we talking about them in the proper order? All right. So we already figured out the goal and the future state and the current state, or are we still doing that? Or are we jumping to plan or solution or countermeasure? And it helps that mindset, that framework, if you will, to use your language, helps people see where the conversation is in the meeting. And so I'm going to quote Richard Sheridan, a wonderful individual over at Menlo Innovations. They have a big banner in their software factory, is what they call it, that says, an example would be really helpful right now. So we're talking about a lot of these concepts. Let's talk about an example. So on the left, you'll see the questions. In red is what we'd call a non-example. And from a learning perspective, behavioral science perspective, it's just as useful to show a non-example, the incorrect way to do it, as it is an example. And this comes up with training within industry as well. So a poor goal statement would be installed underground sprinklers. And the current state is no underground sprinklers. The cause for the difference between 1 and 2, the goal and the actual, is underground sprinklers were never installed. The plan on how to fix that is underground sprinklers, install them. And what can I do to help money for the sprinklers? This provides no value at all. It's just restating the same thing over again. And so what ended up happening here is somebody said, I want underground sprinklers. I'm just going to reverse engineer all the other stuff and put the counter of that into my goal and actual statements. Whereas a better way of saying it is over in the green in the example area. My goal is actually beautiful lawn. My actual, where I'm at today, my current state is dead grass everywhere. The cause of the difference between 1 and 2 is high heat, low moisture, lots of foot traffic, people walking across the lawn. One of the pieces I like for 4, and where I think Bill and I might have some common ground, is we start to talk about not one plan, but options. And working with leadership a lot, including executive leadership, they like to see options, not just one possible plan to go through. And when we look at these options, we talk about testing or experimenting with them. Right. So if I want to do above ground sprinklers, well, can I just buy a cheap one and throw it on the lawn for a few days and see if it works before I invest in a more expensive above ground sprinklers, right? Or things like that. And then, Number five, I absolutely love this question, number five. This is the one when I've coached folks, it seems to stick the most, is what help do you need? If I'm your colleague, if I work for you, if I'm your boss, right, or leader, what help do you need on any of these stages to go through? And that one is a beautiful one to start developing a learning and supportive culture. So this is a non-relevant example, so a non-business example. So let's walk into a business example. And so here's a real one with an organization I worked with before. We start to use a little bit different language, but we get into ideal state is 100% visibility into the identified savings opportunities within the business. Future state one, what is one step closer to that, right, is 50% visibility by the end of the year 2020. And what is our current state? It's 20% visibility. Now, here's a question, an annoying question, granted, that we tend to ask a lot. What is the problem that we're trying to solve? And when you use a structure like this, the straightforward answer is simply the gap between 1 and 2. That is the problem that we're trying to solve. And when it's expressed numerically, it's very easy to see, oh, between current state and future state 1, there's a 30% gap. That is the problem that we're trying to solve first. And then we start to get in what is the cause for the gap between 1 and 2, potential plans to implement. And this is where we get into the experimental mindset quite a bit. You know, we're not certain these things will help. We should do small tests. And I think one of the phrases leaders like is experiments within guardrails, right? So not an experiment that could bring down the whole company or expose us to loss of protected information or put the organization at huge risk, but experiments that are within guardrails that are safe to experiment with. Does that make sense, sir?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And then help do you need? Here's a very common one. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations still make a distinguish between the business and IT. I think they're in the same company. They are both the business, but that language comes up a lot. Here's a little more advanced one. I don't want to get into this one too much, but it's an example of applying it to developing CI behaviors themselves. So I'm going to do a time check here. We're at about 1:45, so I think we're doing okay. Are there any additional comments that you'd like to make, Sensei Bill, before we get into some of the questions?
They're formulating. Go ahead, press on. I will come back to you.
So one of the things I want to leave you guys with is, okay, here's a really basic framework that you can practice yourself. If you need help, yes, there's help available on this. But the way to get this institutionalized as part of your culture is to lead by example. And the best way I know of doing that is to not only develop the skills at every level within the organization, including the president, but also have that individual teach it too. And I love the phrase, to teach is to learn twice. So you think you know something, try to teach it to somebody else. And you relearn a bunch of stuff and you start to see the holes in your own thinking. And I like that mindset of a learning culture where learning doesn't stop at the frontline staff level. It goes everywhere in the organization. So the call to action here is executives, you're part of this too.
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the points, Edward, that I wanted to make is what's the underlying philosophy that you're going after as you go to this implementation? So there's a very often what I've seen in lots of companies is that an executive level somewhere will write a check for a consulting group to come in and teach the supervisors and teach the shop floor about continuous improvement. As if they're hiring a contractor, to paint the ceiling, okay, without their personal involvement. The truth is that if this is really going to stick, it needs to have the full engagement of senior leadership at some appropriate level, okay? They need to be able, as Edward's saying, they need to be able to walk the talk. And I'm sure many people on this call have seen the dynamic where there's a management change. It could only be one person in a critical position, and suddenly the whole lean effort is gone. The Toyota approach suddenly gets replaced by Six Sigma. There's all sorts of variations in terms of a leadership change producing a titanic shift in terms of the approach and the culture of the company. So I can't overstate it enough that the senior leadership does need to be involved in leading by example. It's absolutely a critical piece of it. And if they're going to do that, they need to make the time on their schedule to actually do it. And they also need to know how to be effective in coaching. Because one of the things that was there for years and years was, leading by walking around, right? So basically you get a senior leader, have him or her walk around on the shop floor and see what they see and interact with people. That's the loose cannon approach, because what will happen is that they go to one area, they ask one set of questions, go to a different area, whatever pops up in their mind comes out, which can actually be very distractive and in fact counterproductive. So a coach is a critical piece in terms of developing the skill set and also sending the message at a cultural level that, this is going to stick. This is here to go. This is how we're actually going to behave and run our business. So this is really an absolutely essential piece of it, Edward. I'm glad you put it in there.
Thank you. And thank you for the recommendation as well. One of the things I want to build on with that is, as CI practitioners and coaches, we need to be respectful of people's time. And so for some reason, it's slipped into normalcy that CI training and coaching and development is a week-long event. And so it's a 8-hour a day, 5 days a week in order to become fully CI skilled. And that it's a traditional way of doing it. I'm going to say that it's not the most respectful way of using somebody's time. And the example I'll give for this is simply exercise. Is it better to exercise 1 day a week for 8 hours or 1 hour a day, 7 days a week? Right? And the science will tell us, well, a little bit every day is a better practice, and it helps you develop habit strength, if you will. So with that in mind, I would argue that it's better to do coaching, if you will, for an hour a week with a leader, or sometimes it's recommended in Mike's work, 20 minutes a day with a leader, than it is to try to book them into a room for a full 40-hour week. And so when we do that, we also need to be very intentional with how we respect and use their times. And so that means, not a ton of PowerPoint. It's on the job training. It's practice. They're actually trying to acquire the skill during the coaching session. And I know why it's hard for CI practitioners to coach this way, because it requires us to not be the domain experts. It's nice when we have the slide deck and we know all the key points and the words to say when we're training somebody. But when you do a one-on-one coaching session with a leader and you ask them what is a struggle you're having or a project you're working on, and you try to get them to use this basic framework, and you don't know the answer as the CI coach, it feels uncomfortable. But it does for the learner too. We need to get past that and be, if you will, parsimonious with their time, very, very frugal with their time, because they're good people too. They have high demands on their schedule. They want this. They're just struggling with the how.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to acknowledge some help we've received and some resources that are out there as well. So Mike's provided some input, and it's been fantastic to get his feedback on this. There's a link here to more of his materials. I've been watching a ton of his videos over the years. He has great content. Michigan Lean Consortium is a wonderful organization. There's a link here to be able to join the MLC. They have a lot of great content, a lot of great events. A lot of my colleagues put on events and webinars like this as well. It's wonderful. Jeff Liker, hopefully a lot of you guys have heard about him already, but Dr. Liker is a great mentor and teacher. And there's links to his materials and his resources, as well as Business Science Magazine, which is a behavioral science magazine. It's a periodical. So one of the problems that was identified is behavioral scientists might know their stuff, but they're not very good at talking about it. And we write like scientists, not like practitioners, like everyday people. And so the thought behind Business Science Magazine was to make behavioral science practical and write for people in business, in organizations. So there's a lot of articles and materials that are in there as well. Finally, thank you. Sincere thank you, Sensei Bill, for coming out of retirement, helping co-host this conversation. I always enjoy talking with you and hearing your points, and I grow a little bit every single time. So thank you sincerely for helping out today.
Great, I appreciate the invitation. It's
Yeah.
been a pleasure, of course.
Awesome. Additional contact information is in here, email address, website, Twitter handle. I would say I'm not very active on Twitter. I'm more on LinkedIn. This recording of this video today will be posted on LinkedIn along with the slide deck itself. I think we've answered some of the questions that have come up already just through our dialogue, and we're at time. So thank you everyone for participating today, for listening to this Kelda conversation. We're going to end the video now. Greatly appreciate your time. And I will end the recording, stop sharing, and thank you very much. We had quite a few participants. They're starting to drop off already, but I appreciate your time. Have a good one, and please stay safe.
All right, all. Take care. Ciao. Edward, thank you. Great job.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.